Everyone knows about the journalist cabal within gaming media. It's not a well-kept secret. In fact, it's not even a secret at all, but the amorphous nature of what exactly they are makes it very easy to deny their own existence, or label critics as conspiratorial. When I say the words gaming media, what comes to mind for everyone out there watching this video? For many, the word irrelevance is becoming rather synonymous. For others, ethically bankrupt would be an apt description, and for still others, incompetence probably takes the immediate spotlight. Regardless of what they think about specifically, it's usually rather negative, and the reason for that is quite simple. Over time, gaming media in particular, though this comparison could easily be extended outward to other sections of modern media coverage, has become infested with political activism and agenda-driven coverage with the sole purpose of pushing ideologies upon their readers at the expense of quality, integrity, and material value. This is a topic I address time and time again. Some viewers might even be wondering what I could possibly bring to the table that I have not already, and the answer is very important. Today, I will not bring to the table anything I myself discovered, but rather the assertions and claims made by an anonymous high-ranking source within the mainstream gaming media itself, familiar with and even affiliated with the so-called Cabal, which were given for the sake of exposition to Sophia Narwitz, whom I have come to know quite well in recent months as a quality source of trusted and impactful gaming coverage. To be perfectly clear, I have known that this article was coming for quite some time. I've been discussing a bit behind the scenes with Sophia and a few others. There will be links to everything down below, including her YouTube channel, the article itself, her Twitter page, etc. And I would extend a very genuine call to action for anyone interested in this subject matter to follow those links and support her work. The overview is as follows. We all know the Cabal exists, but the Cabal itself will adamantly deny that existence because to acknowledge it is to acknowledge the element of truth behind the long demonized Gamergate movement. To publicly admit their own cooperation is to admit that a severe and politically driven degradation of media coverage has not only occurred, but festered and grown behind the scenes. Lastly, to acknowledge their long suspected and outwardly obvious behavior would then require introspection, which can be an excruciatingly painful process for those with hypocritical viewpoints or logical inconsistencies. Without further ado, let's really get started. The article by Sophia Narwitz contains many quotes of interest, provided that I trust her source, which I wholeheartedly do. It paints a damning picture of what the industry has become, and to go further, it is also an eerily familiar scenario given the historic example of Game Journo Pros. For those that don't know, Game Journo Pros was a group of journalists found to be in direct communication to control coverage during the height of the Gamergate movement. Now, depending on where you sit and your knowledge of or opinion on Gamergate, you will either view it to be a conspiracy of cosmic proportions designed to attack minorities, or you will understand what it rightfully was, which is an inquisition into moral and ethical integrity in journalism, which was partially co-opted by third parties and then expanded to an extreme degree with exaggeration, hyperbole, and harassment claims. At this junction, years later, it's difficult to dissect the reality of what did and did not occur. Certain lines were crossed on both sides, which is regrettable, but the stone-cold truth is that self-victimization makes for excellent social armor, and there is no doubt whatsoever that this tactic was not only used, it was abused during the pinnacle and aftermath of the Gamergate scandal. So how does this all relate? Well, if you extract the fundamental premise of what Gamergate was meant to attack, at least during the onset, we can see a secretive cabal of journalists leveraging their social network to control coverage. Not only that, a lot of the previous members are now clearly members of this new cabal, which is, as the source clearly states in Sophia's article, intent upon squashing all dissident opinions while leveraging their network to silence the voices of conservative writers. There are a number of truly impactful quotes, but I will condense it down to a few of the more relevant examples. People don't write something, or we won't say anything on Twitter or whatever because you spew one wrong opinion and you're asking for trouble. Unless you don't care about potential opportunities within the industry, a lot of people just don't say what they're actually thinking. They don't want to cover things because they don't like somebody, and that's not how you do journalism, that's blogging. The quotes extend further to cover hyper-relevant examples given recent events, such as the following. If somebody actually wants to see evidence that someone was sexually assaulted, you're immediately thrown under the bus for just wanting to hear both sides of the story, and that you don't support victims, even though that absolutely is not true. There is a further connection made between the same sort of fearful mentality and game developers, not just other journalists. Quote, they can't be open and honest about their actual opinions without something being ripped from them and spun in a way that is negative towards them if they're not on the same page with everybody else. And lastly, a connection back to the leverage that this cabal holds over employment opportunities. Quote, I think you'd be surprised by how many writers can't stand the click in this space. Most won't say anything because they need the work, you know? Combined, these revelations begin to construct an adequate map of what gaming journalism really is, what myself and many others in the independent creator business have long suspected it to be, and what standard gamers and players have been faced with when attempting to find decent mainstream coverage, without perhaps diving into the precise details of why nearly everything feels like a screeching political hit piece. So let's get to examples. The man in the spotlight is Nathan Grayson. Yes, the same Nathan Grayson of Game Journo Pros, a man yet again at the epicenter of unethical journalism, and a figure so mentally inadequate he cannot even construct a logically consistent argument against esports meritocracy, because his comprehension of industry fundamentals is politically blinded to the point of uselessness. This is the type of article that Sophia Narwitz's source was referring to, the type of virtue-signaling moral grandstanding that revolves around Metacritic victimhood and baseless attacks on anyone and everyone for not towing the line. Overwatch Pro quits after harassment over whether she was really playing. Updated. Well, why is it updated? Because the Overwatch Pro who quit over harassment because people thought she wasn't actually playing, and to go further, never existed. The basic gist is as follows. A male Overwatch player concocted a scheme, pretend to be a female player and see what happens, and the results were honestly staggering. Faster than any realistic comparison, this fake female persona got signed to a professional team, and when the community noticed inconsistencies in the available playtime, game session, champion pool, or other metric data that was available to them, they began to call into question whether or not Ellie, that was her fake name, was real. Well, eventually, when the walls of this scam began crashing down and the jig was almost up, Punisher, the male player behind this fake persona, pretended as Ellie to step down. And that was the ignition point for the now exposed journalist cabal. Kotaku and Nathan Grayson were not the only ones by any stretch, but their mistake was being the most blatantly incompetent. Out came a scathing article written by Grayson which contained rhetoric such as the following. Esports is not a meritocracy. It's a male-dominated scene in which gender essentialism runs rampant, and in which women are often made to feel unwelcome. Even in a game as ostensibly inclusive as Overwatch, a woman can't just be a player, not without ample infrastructural support from an understanding team, and Ellie's situation exemplifies why. This situation has led some fans to question what Second Wind did to help Ellie before she left, and why the team didn't publicly decry the harassment she was enduring before her departure. On Twitter, Hughes replied that, "We do what we can for our players, but when it comes down to it, there are only so many things we can do when safety of a player comes into question." Here's where we see a perfectly defined example of the Cabal's behavior. Ellie is not real, yet no effort was placed on verifying the claims being made by the Overwatch community. Rather than investigate, the narrative shifted to attack and shame, which is now a practically mythic battle tactic for the Cabal on par with the art of war for others. Here's the problem. Esports does have a meritocracy, and that meritocratic environment is the sole reason why there are so few female players. Let me elaborate before the inevitable screeching. Let's say you have a chess club in school. There are 10,000 members, and only 100 of them can qualify for regional finals. Since intelligence is a widely accepted attribute that operates independent from any other factor like race or gender, the composition of the final group would probably replicate in a somewhat close fashion the composition of the original player pool. Basically, let's say that 10,000 players are half white, 5,000 players, and half Native American, the other 5,000 players. It can be reasonably assumed that of these 10,000 players, a selection of the top 100, ignoring the myriad of other factors like who practiced more, etc., a selection of the top 100 in a vacuum would be composed of roughly 50 white players and 50 Native American players, give or take. Now, that may seem confusing, but let's change one variable here. Let's say that there are 10,000 players, but only 100 of them are white, and all the rest are Native American, 9,900. If we extend this now to the top level, the 1% of players good enough for nationals, that 100 players, the demographic composition will not be 50-50. Period. The assumption that half of the 100 players in a pool of 10,000 will be good enough is asinine. The real assumption should be that a final 100 player pool of the most skilled students would be 99-1. The 99 being Native American and the 1 being the one individual from that tiny pool of 100 good enough to make the cut. The same is true of esports. Now, to make this even more comedic, as reported by Kotaku, the demographic composition of gamers in terms of male to female varies to an extreme degree based on which genre you examine. For instance, puzzle games are mostly female. Farming and simulator games are as well. But all the way down at the bottom are sports and FPS games, with about 2% of the player population being female. Overwatch is a first-person shooter. It's also a hero shooter, but the point remains that it is towards the bottom of that chart. With that in mind, consider that a pool of 10 million players would be composed of roughly 9,800,000 of those players being male. The other 200,000 are female. Now extend this massive discrepancy in terms of the initial player pool to the apex tier of competition, and what do you see? A reasonable composition would be out of 500 players in the pro scene, as an easy example, 10 of those players might be female. Chasing or advocating for a 50-50 split shows absolute mental deficiency. In fact, with 490 to 10 being the reasonable assumption, it is entirely statistically possible to have 499 to 1, or even 500 to 0. It has nothing to do with sexism or prejudice, or whatever version of phobic is the flavor this month. It has to do with the meritocratic state of a vastly skewed initial player-based composition. That is the quality of journalism from this cabal, because they do not do journalism. They do political agenda pandering. A high-level source has now officially outed this group, a group reformed after letting their corrupt practices run so rampant it caused a headline scandal across the entire country. My hope is that more sources will come forward. My door is always open. I vow to always protect sources, and I have no issue taking specific journalist names and highlighting their failure. This group is also hypocritical to an absolute extreme. There is a common thread of demonizing anyone who uses certain language, whether it be in private or in public, for any reason, despite context or intent. However, some of these figures, spearheading the attacks, are guilty of the exact same behavior. Being thorough is becoming synonymous with victim blaming. Due diligence is now seemingly interchangeable with being prejudiced. And the most egregious sin of all, at least to me, is leveraging the power of a group to prevent the employment of others, especially on the basis of politics. Covering these types of stories can be difficult. Number one, because of the backlash, and I fully expect there to be more than just a modicum of backlash against Sophia Narwitz and possibly myself for covering the topic. However, I see no angle for a substance-based attack, and can only picture a scenario wherein they preach moral superiority and rely on false accusations, as they so often have in the past, to degrade public image. I am not beholden to this cabal because they do not hold any sway whatsoever over where I can and cannot work. I work for myself, and thus they cannot dictate that I be denied a voice and a platform because of my politics. To be fair, they could try, and they might try, and they have tried in the past. A hit piece done on me by a snake from CNET named Ian Schur ended in disaster. I gained more subscribers and donors than any other consecutive 3-day period in the channel's entire history. But the main takeaway is that journalism is infected by a malicious group that undermines the integrity of what the medium could be. Many gamers have long suspected its existence, and to be fair, we honestly knew already that it was there, but this is a new level of confirmation, and we can only hope that it is a lightning rod for future change. But that's it. If you want to support, there are links down below. Merch, Patreon, Twitter, other social media, as well as the article itself from Sophia Narwitz, her social media, everything like that, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.